This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
You know that genetics plays a huge role in our health, and more people are using genetic testing to determine risk for diseases like cancer for themselves and their kids than ever before. So I want to tell you about Orchid. It's the only company that does whole genome testing for embryos, testing before your child is born. If you're doing IVF, this is a clear choice now because now you can reduce risk for thousands of single gene disorders, including heritable forms of autism, pediatric cancers, and birth defects. Check them out at orchidhealth.com. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Unsupervised Learning Podcast. And I'm here today with my friend Murtaza Hussain of the Intercept. You can find him on I was going to say Twitter, but let me just say the X website, just, and also Murtaza, for those of you who follow this podcast know that he's, I have him on for the IBW podcast with Sarah Hyder and Shadi Hamid. Today, I wanted to talk to him specifically, just alone, because I wanted to get a somewhat different perspective on what's happening in the Middle East. And by Middle East now, after 10/7/2023, I mean Israel, Palestine, Gaza, West Bank, et cetera, et cetera. I could talk to Shadi about it, who is an Egyptian Arab ethnically, but, that's more, would get into the nitty gritty of like the geopolitics and the foreign policy, which honestly, whatever, that's not, I don't know. That's not something that I'm like very well versed in myself. So I want to talk about something different. I want to talk more about like the cultural politics and maybe the global politics of the conflict. I have, just had discussions with people. My friend Catherine Brodsky, who grew up partly in Israel, partly in Canada, partly in the Ukraine, I should say, the Ukraine now. About like her perspective as a Jewish person. And, she's actually pretty liberal, internationalist Jewish person, I would say. So, it's not like I was talking to a big BB stan. But, obviously she has her own perspective colored by her own experiences. Murtaza is, you're still Canadian, right? Are you Canadian?
I'm actually American now.
Oh, congratulations. So
I'm
he is now Canadian at heart. Okay, I'm not gonna say anything about Canada right now because that could be a whole different thing. But so your family's from Pakistan, right?
Yeah, they're from Pakistan originally.
Yeah, and so we're both of subcontinental background. I've basically, if you're from from a Muslim subcontinental background, Israel comes up, stuff like that, but it's more kind of at a distance, I would say. A lot of people obviously still will express strong opinions, but it's definitely a little bit more, I don't want to say coarse, but, it's more about solidarity, whereas, there's a lot of people from the Arab world. I mean, Palestinian refugees are massive proportion of the population in places like Jordan. They were a big proportion of the population in places like Kuwait before the first Gulf War, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a different level of intimacy there with the conflict. What I want to ask, though, is, a substantial, even a minority of the American left reacted initially, at least, and to some extent, I think this is like very, very a minority, but I think there are still some people reacted positively to I'm just gonna say the actions. I'm not gonna specify like any judgment on what happened on that day. Can you just and like there were some people online who were saying this is what decolonization looks like, et cetera, et cetera. Other people were shocked.
And I think you were trying to express, I'm not saying in the middle opinions, but trying to contextualize a little bit where they were coming from. And so can you just tell us, where they're coming from as opposed to just kind of an emotional outrage reaction, which was, I think, common in the US.
Yeah, I really didn't like that actually. When that happened, I was pretty disturbed by some people's reactions. I've been like interested and emotionally invested in this issue for a long time to some degree, particularly as I feel kind of responsible as an American taxpayer. That's kind of first lens that will come at it from. So the way people were acting online, it was really wrong in my opinion, because, obviously you frame this subject, which I think is the appropriate frame in terms of human rights, international law, and so forth. And, in any form of law or any form of morality, including, you could say, religious morality, you can't kill non-combatants. You can't do something like that. And, there's a distinction. And I think, unfortunately, there's this very resilient, radical leftist tendency, which has become very popular in the developing world. And it really took on a great life in Muslim majority countries, where it was sort of Islamized in some ways as well, too, you could say, where, the moral limits on conflict and so forth are lifted. And, if you have what you deem to be a just goal, any means to that goal is acceptable. And I think this has become a very popular kind of idea, unfortunately. But I don't really like that or defend it. I was pretty disturbed after October 7th. I was shook up a little bit by that. As somebody who, is very sympathetic to, as someone who cares about the subject, I just didn't like what I was seeing. So I will say that I do think those people who are gloating and, making those kind of comments, I do think that they are a very loud minority, because a lot of people I know responded the way I did. They were like pretty disturbed by what happened and not happy about it. And even if they're sympathetic with the Palestinian national cause generally, which long predates Hamas and has kind of been going on for much longer than Hamas has been prominent in it, and much longer than October 7th, they still didn't like that. And I think the people like this decolonization looks like, I think you have to, every group of people, every movement has like a very loud segment of people, and they may not be the most, but they can be the most visible. So, I think that was one person who made that comment, but it was echoed by other people too online. So I think that, first I have to say a statement of principle, like it's not okay. And that's not, if that's what decolonization looks like, then we have to say that decolonization has some serious, more blind spots. And I think that that's not what most people contextualize it as. So I have to say that, irrespective of what's happened since then, what happened on that day was wrong. And I think that what you have to also think about is that there's a long-term cycle of violence that's been going on here. And I will say that some people, when they acted so crazy, they acted crazy because, there were like some really big massacres that took place in Gaza a couple of years before that, a couple of them, and no one really talked about it. And it was kind of like not really part of the understanding of the events leading up to what happened that day. So then, you can see that now Israelis are running very radicalized and angry about what happened on that day. And now they're retaliating. And then eventually the Palestinians are going to be even more radicalized and retaliate for this. This is a long-term thing that's going on. I just have to say that, we can't descend into complete pit of nihilism. And, those of us who have the benefit of distance, like I don't blame Israelis and Palestinians. If someone kills your family or displaces you from your home or kills your neighbors, something like that, you're going to react in a way which you view as necessary, or you have deep, emotional reasons, or, you're just trying to survive, even. Like you could look at it that way. But if we have the benefit of distance, I think people like us should try to respond in a way which is cool-headed and keeps our moral principles intact. And, I think that I'm trying to do that. It's just kind of difficult. And I think that the people on both sides who fail that and let their emotions get the most of them will become, bloodthirsty. That's wrong. And I can forgive any Palestinian or any Israeli for anything, but I cannot forgive a bloodthirsty American on either side. That's like, I find that to be quite morally condemnable. If you're going to be bloodthirsty about the subject or vitriolic, go do something else. We have enough of that, or they have enough of that at this point. So that's kind of the way I think about it. And I could go on, but I would say that I just want to. You brought up with October 7th. That's just the way I responded to that initial reaction. I was also averse to it, you could say.
Yeah, I mean, from what I can tell, I think there's been like several reactions, say on the Palestinian side. I think one reaction has been denialism. Now this has been, I think, unfortunately supported by some exaggerations in the media, which always happen with these sorts of things. Like, I'm old enough to remember 9/11. And just the media, it used to be just the British media, to be honest. I remember specifically would exaggerate atrocities or whatever. But now it's just all the media. I think this is digital media's impact. And I know you're the digital media yourself, so I'm not. But you know what I'm saying. It's just like the sensationalism. But then I think the way that a lot of that I've seen, Palestinians being interviewed, say in the West Bank or something, they just don't think a lot of the atrocity. They just didn't happen, you know? And so like, if it didn't happen, if they were just killing soldiers, all's fair.
Well, one thing I will say that I'm in the official Hamas Telegram channels for research purposes and also like the Iranian Telegram channels. Their depiction, which is what they depict to the public of what happened on that day, is a professional military operation. And, they said recently, Hamas said recently that, we aim to kill soldiers and targets, but if some civilians were killed, that was a mistake. Like that's kind of their narrative to them. And people tend to, that's what shapes their worldview. And I think it's kind of the same on our side in a way too. We just assume that everything we're doing is a professional military operation. We're told that by our officials, and the vast majority of us will take that for granted. It's very different from seeing something very viscerally in person and like shaping your worldview. My own perception is, I think that there is like, it's very tempting to find it morally unique or condemnable in a given case. But I think it's kind of human nature. People think the best themselves and the worst of others. That's happening on both sides in this case. No one wants to believe bad things and the complexity, that can take place on their own side. I will say that my experience in situations of armed conflict and the aftermath of armed conflict, it really unleashes the beast inside human beings on all sides. So I tend to assume the worst things usually are true and whenever they're taking place. In a case like this, with such intense information warfare, it's very difficult to know what's going on when you're not there. Even if you are there, it's kind of difficult to know what's going on. So I will just say that, I see that people are denying things, denying what happened on October 7th, denying stuff that happened since then, like death tolls of Palestinians and things like that, or saying the pictures are fake or whatever like that. That always happens. It's not just unique to this conflict. It happens in every single conflict. It just kind of tells me that this is much more typical a conflict than atypical in many ways, as horrible as that is.
Yeah, let me so you're American, I'm American. One of the things I think before we got on, I just said, candidly, and I've said this plenty of times, so not a big shock to my listeners. Most Americans don't know what's going on outside this country in very much detail at all. And after 9/11, some people, only the Ron Paul people, really said much about blowback outside of maybe the far, far left. And Americans were shocked, like, well, why would we have blowback? And of course, if anyone has a cursory understanding of America's involvement in the world, they know that our hands are in everything, for good or ill. It depends on what your perspective is. Sometimes things happen. So, for example, My Lai massacre in Vietnam is a pretty famous case. Younger listeners can Google it. But, things of the organized scale of My Lai might not have happened in Afghanistan or Iraq, but there were, I mean, look, I've known people that are Iraq War veterans. They just candidly said, look, there's a lot of things that happened that you don't know about that are really fucked up, and that's just reality of war, like you're saying. So that's not shocking. What I think, do you think that, and I've read multiple different things, you're on the Hamas Telegram channel. Do you think that they anticipated the magnitude of, let's just quote, say their success? Because it's, part of the issue is some of the things that likely did happen caused like such an extreme reaction, even in left-wing Jews, that, we are where we are. Let's just put it that way.
Actually, after the initial October 7th, there was a really interesting interview where it was an Arab diplomat, and he was like in touch with Hamas or something, where he was sort of communicating with them in the aftermath. And I think that it really was unexpected what happened on that day, including to them, in the sense that, they didn't expect the Israeli military to fold the way that it did in the area and the Gaza envelope, the Gaza battalion, which is in charge of maintaining the border. They kind of collapsed in a way which they had no precedent for. So, at the end of that, you had all the guys just roaming around roaming around Israel for a day and a half or 48 hours, many of them with no real orders of what to do after that because they've been tasked with wiping out these military bases, and then now they just kind of on their own. And then you also had all these criminal groups and other smaller militant organizations based in Gaza, which also just kind of took advantage of the breakdown in order. Many of them had never left Gaza, or they just were like pending there for a very long time. And they only interact with Israelis being bombed by them. They don't really see Israelis other than that. So, they went out there and took advantage of the situation. And I think some of the crimes, or a lot of the crimes were committed by them, ones against civilians and by Hamas fighters as well, too. But I don't think that they ordered it for that. I'm seeing the evidence of that for the main reason that I don't think they expected to get that far. I don't think they expected to get so deep in Israel. And they even said later, if we knew what happened, we would have maybe, gone to Tel Aviv or something like that. We would have made orders or contingencies to what to deal with. Also, you have to understand too that Palestinians in the whole 75 years, they haven't really been in a position when they could kill a lot of people per se. Like that's not a calculation or regulations they have to make for it because it just wasn't really possible. So, now they have to develop, like, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but if they were in that position, they have to develop regulations and procedures to avoid that because, leaving aside the moral and legal aspects of it, which are quite serious, it's politically and strategically bad. It's injurious to their own national cause to do that. And I think they've realized that. And that's why they're making these statements now to distance themselves from what took place in that day. And, I will say the implication of their statements saying that any killings of civilians were unintended or accidental in the course of the operation, whether it's true or not, it does kind of indicate that they do believe that there are people who are civilians in Israel, which, some of the decolonization people are suggesting there's not, which it's really dangerous kind of suggestion. So, I kind of went on a tangent there, but I think that's kind of what it is. And I will note that in the Israeli response to what happened, there's been a lot of reporting about it now. They seem to have loosened to the point of breaking or disregarding what you could call laws of war. I think there's been like 30,000 people by some estimates, not including people buried under the rubble, who've been killed in Gaza so far. There's been reports and videos really made of by themselves, and broadcasts of humiliation, torture, and executions of people there. So I think that, it's something it's a very ugly situation. It's a very ugly conflict. I think a lot of it now on both sides is about revenge. That's like a prime driver beyond anything else, motivating both parties. And, I kind of would get it if I was there. But the thing I'm thinking about more is the fact that we, as Americans or as people outside the region, very far from the region, are kind of placed into it in a way. Like the impact of this conflict are very source of great toxic division and distraction for us. And we can't do anything really to ameliorate it, or, it's very difficult seemingly to do so. So you're then forced to take a side, kind of, which, it's a really, people try to avoid doing that. It's not good to live in a society which is in wartime. We're not a society that's wartime, but we have to act almost as though we are and deal with the negative social consequences, political consequences of that. So I think that is something which, if I were to take a minimalist perspective, is what I'm thinking about the most, is why this is bugging me, you could say.
Yeah. It's complicated because it's already complicated. Now we have the complication of, what you just alluded to in the beginning of your comment, the massive success, which, I stay up late. I'm a night owl. And so before I went to sleep, I started seeing Twitter live streams of Hamas
in Israel, Israelis that are doing Twitter live streaming. When initially I saw that, and it was quite clear in the comments on Twitter or X, no one understood the magnitude of what was happening at all. They just assumed it was 20 people that got into their kibbutz. They had no idea that it was all that they had busted out. Okay. So, that took a initial, there was a time of just reacting. I'm assuming it was the same on the other end. I also want to say something about the demographics. The whole thing is like, all the children being killed. Well, I mean, it's a fact. 50% are under 18. Gaza has one of the higher, outside of a few places in Africa, is the highest total fertility rate in the world, like way higher than the West Bank. So that makes sense. A lot of the Hamas, militants that broke through, they were probably 17, 18. They're probably very young. And I'm just going to say, young men in wartime situations, the record is not great in terms of how they behave.
Well, I will say something. Actually, this is one of my things I say a lot because my brother is a criminal lawyer, and I get a lot of insight into that kind of world as a result of him. He was like, one thing I learned from like him is that basically, if you look at the crime rates for young men across any demographic, it's really high until the age of 30 when it just completely collapses. So, young men are very dangerous generally, and that's in America, that's in Israel, Palestine, everywhere else is. They need very strong guidelines and, strong controls until they get to that age where they kind of cool off on their own or begin to cool off, you could say. So, I've seen also in these circumstances of political conflict, paramilitary groups, they don't really have officers and command and control, and they don't have this professionalization standards that you'd see in the more developed military. So, the controls that you need to have over young men are weaker, typically as a result. So it doesn't really surprise me if people with the not wearing uniforms tend to do the worst stuff in wartime. I will say that I've been on TikTok a lot. I'm watching these TikTok videos of Israeli soldiers in Gaza, and it seems like because of the conscript army, the discipline is also not that strong. Maybe it's not as much as a paramilitary, but it seems that they're doing things which, if they were done in the American military, would result in discipline or, serious repercussions, but it seems like it's not. So I think that the level of hatred is actually overwhelming these sort of norms that we associate with developed countries. And, they're both, I think that Hamas is interesting. Like, I think if they had what I think they planned to do, what seemed more realistic, was taking a couple dozen soldiers hostage, wipe out a few bases, bring them back to Gaza, and then negotiate for prisoner release, a reopening of the port in Gaza, maybe the end of the blockade and things like that. Instead, they had this big, huge, like, mass killings of 1,200 people or so. Then they have to fight the whole Israeli military inside Gaza, which they're doing right now, which I don't think they want. Gaza's been destroyed, more or less. But now, both sides have been like a radicalization and like a fearalization of both the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think it's going to continue from that. So it's just like it's really ugly to see, and I don't really see what's going to stop it at this point. So I think you could say Hamas is going to get worse, and the Israelis are also going to get worse, and they're getting worse, and you can kind of see it happening in real time. Mm-hmm. So that's like interesting. It's going to be really interesting to watch, and it's interesting to see how that comports with the fact that this subject and this conflict is such an integral part of our own politics. It's considered a domestic political issue in the United States, even though it's becoming increasingly alien to everything that people typically here tend to believe or value.
Yeah, it's interesting that you point out the conscript army issue. In America, we haven't had the draft in decades. And so our army is relatively, I'm going to say it is professionalized. I do know a few people that are officers or reservists. It's very professionalized. They're also not, another thing that people know about America's army, they're not typical of the American population as a whole as well. There's almost like a kind of like a cultural, there's families where there's multiple generations of enlisted men and women now. They tend to be, for example, there's a big base where I live in San Antonio nearby, And, it's in San Antonio. So a lot of Latinos, more, I would say, working class to lower middle class is most of the pipeline. So it's a different culture. And it's a whole different world that a lot of professional managerial class Americans no longer know. First of all, that's an interesting point. But they have their own norms and their kind of like the way of doing things. Whereas, you can imagine if we had the draft, just imagine if like, your colleagues, you know what I'm saying? Like these like Brooklyn journalists, there are some that are young enough that might be drafted and like what they would do as conscripts. And I think in Israel, there was a massive issue with look, when it comes to the other side, we know that people will do what they will do. Like, we don't need to get the details, but, they killed the hostages by mistake. And that just shows, though. So the soldiers, there was the incident I'm just referring to, which I think you know about, where there are 3 hostages that escaped, and they, showed a white flag, and they were Israeli. The Israeli soldiers, first of all, they killed the first 2. The third one actually escaped and tried to hide, and another soldier ran him down and shot him. And these are obviously not professional soldiers to behave like that. They were just like, they were operating out of fear and terror. And, that's the consequence. And in war, like all these things will happen. But now we live in a world of TikTok, live streams. We have like Yemeni Houthis doing TikToks, like little pirates. So it's a really strange, disorienting world, I think, for a lot of people who don't know how to react to it.
Yeah, I wanted to also go back to something we talked about at the beginning, or you kind of mentioned, I think, before we started recording, talking about the issue of, why is this issue so globalized? Why is South Africa care about this issue? Why is it going even beyond like the specific ethnic or religious groups ostensibly involved directly in the conflict? I do think this is an important point I wanted to address. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is effectively a nationalist conflict that has religious overtones to it as well, too, because of the fact that it does cross over a particular 2 different groups of people. And also, very importantly, the territory, specifically Jerusalem, has a very significant, great cultural and religious significance to, billions of people. So it's very sensitive by nature and requires a sensitive sort of solution to deal with. I do think the reason that it became it's so resonant even beyond that, because you have to keep in mind that this conflict is going on for 70 years. It was one of many, you could say, a series of conflicts which are all seen as related in some way. And there were these kind of post-colonial conflicts that existed in different parts of the world. South Africa was one of them. The struggle between the ANC and the Afrikaner government. Northern Ireland was another one. Sri Lanka was another one. And these groups all kind of, they cooperated. They saw themselves identified. At that time, they identified a lot of them as leftists or Marxists because, they're hoping to leverage the negative polarization between the U.S. and Soviet Union to win support from usually what were basically nationalist causes. So, the Israel-Palestine conflict, if you look at the trajectory of most of those conflicts, with the exception of Sri Lanka, they ended in the early 90s, and they ended during the end of the Cold War. So when the Cold War ended, there was really strong incentive to put those to bed as well, too, because it was seen as like there's a big structural change in the system. Both sides see this is no longer really sustainable. We should, negotiate a solution. And they also tried to negotiate that with Sri Lanka as well, too. But, Northern Ireland had a peace deal. South Africa, there was a negotiated end to apartheid. And there was the Oslo process in Israel-Palestine. So they would really made the best effort at that time to negotiate an end to it. Because I think that, on the Israeli side, they were like, well, our big selling point, like the Afrikaners, was that we're the bulwark against communist-linked regimes in the region, and we can be useful to the U.S. that way. Now that is gone, so maybe we need to, settle this out. And they came so close to doing it. They came so close to ending. And there's a lot of this dispute over who was right and who was wrong, who was ultimately kiboshed it. But, effectively, they fumbled the ball, and they couldn't end that conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict, the same way that the Irish conflict, the South African conflict ended. So it's the unfinished business of that period. So a lot of people in Africa, people who identify with what you can call a third worldism, which it's like an ideology, which is, I can't really say it's an ideology, but it's like some sort of tendency in politics.
Yeah, coalition.
Coalition, yeah, third worldism. This is like, we settled all our accounts in that century, but not only did we fail to settle this one, it's gotten much, much worse in that time. Things are happening. I think this Israel-Palestine conflict is much worse than the South Africa conflict at this point in terms of level of death and destruction and hatred that exists on all sides. It's a lot worse, So, to them, it's like, we're betraying our own country by not our own national cause by not addressing this in turn.
Yeah,
if you
unfinished.
Yeah, unfinished. If you look at it, I think it's been suppressed now. It's kind of like in decline. But in India, there was like this very strong third worldist tendency for a long time. India always saw itself as the leader of the global South. So it took actually a very strident perspective on the Israel-Palestine conflict for a long time until later on, also at the end of the Cold War and then developing later from developed this conflict with Pakistan or exacerbated them. And, it said, well, we can't take the stance that we have now. And then now currently the Indian government, which views more things in religious terms. And it's not pro-Israel, but it's, takes great pride in being neutral, friendly ties with it. But it still wants to have ties with the Arab countries. So it's kind of like a tough situation anyways. But, it's kind of changed. But the countries which still see themselves as kind of third worldist or non-aligned movement-ish, this is like, a situation that they always felt that they had to deal with, and they still want to finish it off and deal with it the way they did others. And I'll say this is very ironic, and this is kind of the tragedy situation in a way, is that obviously Jews were not very well treated in Europe for a long time, like their own perception, with the culmination being, of course, the Holocaust and the killing of European Jews and so forth. So a lot of them, when Israel was created, they saw it themselves as sort of turning his back on West, which had mistreated them. And David Ben-Gurion, very interestingly and ironically now, he tried to attend the Bandung conference, the famous anti-colonial conference happened in the 50s, where all these post-colonial African, Asian nations, Latin American nations got together to say, develop what became the non-aligned movement and so forth. He tried to attend because he thought Israel was part of that, but he was kind of told later on, no. I think Nehru said yes, but then he talked to Nasser. Nasser was like, "It's fucked up. You can't have him here." And then they got rejected. And then Israel kind of like had to lean back into becoming
drift off.
Yeah, outpost of the West or something in Asia. It's kind of a tough thing to maintain in a way if you think about it. It gives kind of colonial vibes, even if that's not how they saw it originally. Or maybe they did see it originally, but maybe it's that hard to maintain that. So it's layers of mutual distrust and mutual failing to understand the other's perspective, which now have embedded themselves over time. So, what is a solution to this conflict? I've never been more pessimistic about the idea there's not a solution to it.
Yeah, so I guess, I want to talk a little bit more about this issue, the issue of Palestinian nationalism, thinking of it as like a inverse to Zionism, which is, Jewish nationalism. So a lot of people think of Hamas, it's sponsored by Iran, which is, pretty much a theocracy. Not pretty much. It is a theocracy. It's technically ruled by jurists, right? And then, Hamas comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist movement. But Palestinian nationalism as a whole, has roots after World War II, after 47. And, up until, as you were saying earlier, a lot of these movements up until 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, were getting funding, training, and support from the Soviet bloc. And so Palestinian nationalism was part of a global leftist movement, along with ETA and other movements. So ETA is in Spain. And if you watch the movie The Baader Meinhof Complex, which talks about the Red Brigades, who were, by the way, we now know, funded by East Germans. Ultimately the Russians, but also the East Germans. So the Red Brigade, they're terrorists in the 1960s and 70s and into the early 80s. And they were sent for training with the PLO, which indicates the connection between the global left and the Palestinian national movement. And, Palestinians are obviously mostly Muslim, and the Islamist cast today is very, very salient. But traditionally, they haven't been like that. Christians have been overrepresented in Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. The PFLP, which is part of the PLO, along with Fatah, is more radical, is Marxist, and was founded by someone from a Christian background, a Christian Orthodox, George Habash, Orthodox Christian background. And in fact, there have been like Christian background Palestinians who've committed suicide attacks. I think it was in Lebanon actually, but just interesting trivia. And so I think this is the context that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of the solidarity with the Palestinians from left-wing movements and left-wing individuals have seen inexplicable. And I think a lot of it is kind of like jumping on board memes and, following elite influencers. But this isn't out of nowhere. There is an organic aspect to it that goes back to decades through personal relationships and coalitions, right?
Yeah, you know what? Like, not to give a gigantic history lesson, but I think it's useful for context to point out what you mentioned. Like, in the last, I'd say, 20, 30 years, there's been this Islamization of the Palestinian national cause. Started slowly, but it kind of took root, it gained momentum over time. I think that the major impetus was that, obviously, leftism and secular nationalism was super popular in the Arab world for a long time. But it was dealt a very crushing defeat, specifically by Israel in the 1967 war. That's when Gamal Abdel Nasser, his really charismatic, popular Arab leader, existed. As you mentioned, a lot of the Palestinian national movement, the radical militant ones, were led by Christians, and they did, acts of violence and so forth. It's because it was a nationalist cause. I think that what the Islamist groups did was, it wasn't that, they made society more theocratic just by virtue of their arguments, something like that. They just had an argument that, like, okay, these guys failed in the thing that's really important to you, which is like your national cause. We're a better role model. We're a better exemplar of that. We're more committed. We're not corrupt because we're religious. We're more willing to make sacrifices and fight, and we're going to be more effective at doing that. And that's kind of their argument. And so I think it was actually very interesting. There's a guy who's been very vocal now. He's former head of the Shin Bet, which is Israel's internal and domestic security service. And it's an important thing to know in Israel, the people who tend to be more dovish about the Palestinian issue ironically tend to be the senior levels of the security establishment, because as has been described to me by Israelis, these guys actually know the reality, whereas the politicians tend to manipulate people's fears and lack of knowledge, lack of proximity. So they tend to be more conciliatory and dovish. Ami Ayalon is the former head of the Shin Bet. He said that, look, the reason that Palestinians support Hamas, or a lot of support, is because Hamas says that it's a support for nationalism. And they said that they're the more effective ones to defend nationalism of your people, to defend your land and your homes, the things you care about. So that's kind of the origin of it, per se. So I think that if you look at this historically, people tend to think, well, if there is this era of, religious conservatism, people internationally looking at it in the Palestinian national movement, it's just a phase. It's a phase which didn't exist before and maybe it won't exist in the future. But the thing we don't want to lose sight of is this cause that we found attractive and important prior to that, and will continue to feel when we believe this phase passes. So I think that has, it's important context. In Iran, it is a theocracy, but it's kind of like not enough to understand what it believes and why it does the thing it does. Because, Saudi Arabia also is super, I guess, almost a theocracy because it's monarchy, but it has very strong theocratic cultural elements, the religious conservative elements, more so even than Iran in some ways. It has very different policies. I think that it's like a interesting and important but insufficient explainer of its foreign policy. Iran was created in 1979. It's kind of like the Islamic Republic of Iran. It specifically defined itself as like a third worldist power. That's why it would also do things at least really like express support for like BLM or things like that, which it sees as exemplifying this third worldism. So, that's part of its ideology, is inextricably tied to it. It's kind of like
Well, I mean, have you read much about Red Shiism?
Yeah, Red Shiism, Black Shiism, Ali Shariat. Yeah, it's a very important text to understand the Islamic Republic of Iran. And, you could say it's corrupt. It doesn't really believe those things anymore. I think there's a lot of substance to that. Or it believes it's more a Persian nationalist regime with religious overtones. Also an argument people make. But, that's kind of just like, it's an important way to understand why they do the things they do. They reject the international system. They created it as a revolutionary system during the Cold War to create like a third bloc in the Cold War. And has that kind of dated, I would say, perspective on the way the world is, but they've kind of resolutely committed to it. So that's kind of an aspect of it. And yeah, so you see South Africa and Ireland also supporting the Palestinians a lot because they have like this kind of like, that's the genealogy of the worldview. And I don't know. Like, I don't really know what's going to happen now. I'm not particularly optimistic, but that's kind of like the whole.
I think the key is like there's a not the key, but just it's an important aspect that Americans don't understand. Okay, so there is the ideological aspect. Obviously, left-wing nationalism, you can bracket that as like a family of movements. And unlike right-wing nationalism, left-wing nationalism tends to be internationally coordinated because it has an internationalist foundation of liberation of peoples. Probably you could root it back to the 19th century, but these left-wing nationalist movements exist all across the world, and they've always had connections, right? Then there's a personal connection. So, the ANC did have an armed wing, and that armed wing did get support from the Soviet bloc, and this was one of the reasons that people like Thatcher supported the South African regime to some extent, right? But these also like tie with personal connections. There were communists. There's a communist wing of the ANC, it's part of the ANC, and a lot of those guys, yes, they're black, but they're not Pan-Africanist, which was a different, I would say, a more conservative in some ways, a traditionalist wing, but they're not Pan-Africanist. They're global. And they have a global view, and they might have trained or like been in exile at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow with people from guys that are from Fatah or other left wing nationalist movements. So I think if I'm correct, Thabo Mbeki, who was former president of South Africa, he was from that internationalist wing of the ANC, and people would comment like his closest friend was an Indian South African activist, but the point there is he was actually a pan-racial person in terms of his life and his experience. And so it wouldn't be proper to really understand him as, as you would expect, like a typical African leader. He was actually out of a global left nationalist movement, right? And he had these personal connections. And if they have personal connections, they're not just going to, yes, they want to be accepted by the United States and by the West and be integrated into the trade and the prosperity of that bloc. But if they still have personal connections to these left-wing figures in other places, they, a lot of people are not going to cut that off.
I will use this point to make a broader point, which I think is important, is like, the reason that we're talking about this conflict and takes so much energy as opposed to many other conflicts you go on in the world is because this conflict has been successively globalized by both sides in multiple waves. So you can see on the Israeli side, they first globalized it by reaching out to elites, mainly elite audiences in, first Turkey, it was in the Ottoman Empire. That was why they started lobbying for the creation of Israel. Then England, European elites, and then finally, for a long time, American elites. So they've globalized it in that way over time. The Palestinian side has tried to globalize it also in different ways. First, they reached out to the Arab population of the region. That was like an Arab phase of globalization of it. Then, corresponding with that, the leftist sort of globalization of the subject. That's how you get these connections to South Africa and Ireland and so forth. And then the Islamic, the Muslim world globalization of it. So they'll happen like consecutively or, some overlap, but that's kind of it. And you see the traces of all three of those phases of globalization in support on various sides of this cause. So what I would say is that, because it's so globalized, it's unlike, let's say, like the Ethiopia conflict in Tigray or something like that today, which is also a very bad conflict. It has a lot of negative political implications. And I find it very unfortunate living in America because it's a very toxic form of, I think I've said this before, it's a very toxic distraction and, diversion and division is the word I'm looking for, actually, in the politics of here and many other places, which is why I wish that, the U.S. would either try to play a role in forcing it to come to an end, which it could do because it's such a powerful player in this conflict. It could pressure a solution, which it kind of should do as the outside imperial force in the region. That's what empires, I use a non-pejorative term, like they normally settle local tribal and ethnic disputes within their dome of influence, on their own. America's not doing that. Or it should just leave and not be part of it and then let them sort it out themselves, which, also would be fine. It wants to be involved in a very polarizing way, which I think is, is a bit detrimental to the U.S. as well too, which ultimately is what I think I care about the most because someone who pays taxes here. So that's kind of it. So then, that's how it got to be the where it is and why we're kind of stuck where we are with it at the moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like historical contingency matters. So people like Robert RFK Jr. is a former Democrat running as an independent now, has kind of a populist left orientation, but he is of a certain age, of a certain background. His father was pro-Israel after the 67 war, or around that period. And he has come out in support of Israel, and that's been a massive problem with the populist libertarian and populist left base. But this is partly just because of his history, his background, his age,
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, it's a very difficult subject to navigate. I feel like it's more constructive that rather than people tend to treat it as like a team sport and cheer on as bloodthirstily as possible for their respective team. And I kind of get that on a populist level, but if you're going to think about it or deal with it on a more sophisticated way, it's better to try to identify possible compromises or political solutions and things like that. So, I kind of have so when I was growing up, I knew lots of Palestinians, so I obviously see their perspective. Like, I know them. They're just normal people. They're, also Palestinians, they kind of remind me of Desis in some ways, in the sense they're very fanatically committed to education in that way. Like, their kids have to be doctors, be engineers. Like, it's that kind of hustle kind of culture, I guess, because in where they live, they don't have that many opportunities. They want to really take advantage of it when they get somewhere. So, I see their perspective a lot. As I got older, I've known Israelis and people who are very pro-Israel or Jewish, or, most of them are pro-Israel, I would say. And, I understand their perspectives too. I get it. I see it. Where they're coming from. I don't see either side as inhuman or beyond the pale in some way. I'd like to see some sort of compromise in that way, and I think that because I have both those experiences, it's kind of unique. But, I just don't see how that could happen anytime soon now, because the level of polarization has become so acute that unless some very unforeseen change happens in U.S. politics, which makes the U.S. like a neutral broker of the conflict and pursuing it in terms of their own interest, which is just put an end to it in a conciliatory way that satisfies both sides. I don't see how that's going to happen. So I just kind of think that if we're not going to play a constructive role, we should extricate it. But, it just makes me sad because I do think that, how to put this another way, okay, now there's so much hatred now. So everyone wants to portray the worst side of each other. But I see good things in both sides, actually. Like the general people of both sides, I see a lot of good and a lot of potential. But as long as it continues to spiral of radicalization and hostility and hatred, which is, people will debate where it started, but it's clearly in the midst of it now, I don't see any constructive way this is going to be resolved. So why are we embedding ourselves in a situation which is maybe hopeless? It's a little...
I mean, have you watched from the movie From Dusk Till Dawn, 1995, I think?
No.
So Dusk Till Dawn has Quentin Tarantino and George Clooney, and they're two brothers who are bank robbers, and you don't even know the whole it's just action sequences tied together by a thin plot. But there's one sequence, basically Quentin Tarantino's character is kind of like a psychopathic, just kind of like a funny but seriously mentally ill guy who causes all these conflicts, while George Clooney just wants to kill people to get money. So he doesn't really want to kill that many people. He just wants to kill who he needs to kill to get the money. Whereas Quentin Tarantino is kind of gratuitous, and so Quentin Tarantino is convinced that some convenience store clerk or something actually has is going to do something, and that he's not going to give him the money, but the guy was just going to give him the money, I think, if I remember the scene correctly, and let them go. But Quentin Tarantino's we got to kill him because now he's a witness and he's going to do this and that. And the guy actually did have a gun, but he had to reach for the gun because Quentin Tarantino was going to kill him. And George Clooney, he's observing the situation. He's like, why are you going crazy? We just wanted the money and get out of here. But the guy has now pulled the gun and is reacting defensively. And so the brothers have to kill him. And George Clooney is and the guy, as he's shooting back, is I was going to let you go with the money. We didn't need to do any of this. And Clooney's yeah, we didn't, but Now I've got to kill you or you're going to kill me. Like, I'm telling you this because I feel like some of the Palestine-Israel issues are kind of like, okay, like, at the beginning of this sequence of events, it would have been so easy for, quote unquote, easy, to decouple and figure out a solution that optimizes, the minimax or whatever game theory you want to say, solution for the two sides. But, pulling it more recently, okay, what happened on 10/7 from the Jewish perspective? Like, a lot of the bloodthirsty comments that you see obviously were because of the nature of the actions. The nature of those actions are a response to decades of oppression, right? Of, colonization, subjugation, and then later the blockade of Gaza. And those are a reaction to Jewish fears of, say, multiple Arab wars to blot Israel out of existence, to drive them back into the sea. So, I mean, there's a sequence of events. And as you're going further and further back in time, the tit for tat is accelerating and amping up. And then after 10/7, you had the massive response and basically the leveling of Gaza. And so now you have a situation where you want these people to just, let's come to the table and figure out an optimal solution. But
it's so interesting because it's so possible to have such an extensive debate about who's at fault or where it started or what happened this time or what could have happened then. And, I guess they have to do that if they have to live in the region. But the thing is, for us to have to do it as Americans or people who live in the United States, why are we involved in an intractable ethnic and religious conflict in this side of the world so intimately? Why are we embedding our own politics in this such that it's causing significant harm to our own country in terms of political division, a lot of stagnation and paralysis in politics, polarization? Why embed ourselves in ethnic conflicts that we don't actually have a stake in per se and make it so important to our own politics? And, you could say that, okay, one group will say, well, you should stop making it important. The other group will say, well, you should stop making it important. It's like, there has to be mutual disarmament. I think that because kind of money in politics is a big part of it. It's like, that's embedding us in this situation. And I think that rather than trying to, untangle this web, which people are not going to come to agreement about in the end, why don't you step back and leave the region? Let's focus on things which are important to us. That's kind of how I think about it now. And it's a huge economic drain in a way on the U.S. too, because it's not just the U.S. This is like, they're so deeply embedded in the situation that, obviously there's a huge military aid to Israel every year, and some people argue, well, the aid is actually bad for Israel, which I don't really find plausible in that argument. I've read some of those arguments. But also the U.S. pays effectively a lot of money to uphold on the Palestinian side to these NGOs and stuff, which basically, they, in a way, they govern, they kind of provide some sort of framework of a government in the absence of a government to state which doesn't exist. But in reality, they kind of subsidize what Israel wants in a way too, because it pays for the occupation in a way. Like, it makes it cheap enough that you can actually do it by having the international community do it. And then, but also on top of that, you're paying Egypt, you're paying Jordan, you're also deploying U.S. troops in the region to act as deterrents for various things, and protecting, kind of insulating Israel from having to make compromises with more of some of its neighbors, which are more willing to make compromises with it to fight Iran or whatever else it is. So it's a huge expenditure strategically, just on the economic aspect of it too. Why can't we step back and just not be involved? That's like a pretty reasonable position, I think. And I think Americans want that as well. So they don't want to be involved in the region anymore. They don't want any more wars. They don't want to be mired in a very painful and convoluted ethnic and religious conflict that we shouldn't have a stake in on national terms. So I think that's kind of the minimalist way I look at it. And I would say about Palestinians that, I notice on the popular discourse about it in the US, people tend to look at it like in a woke versus anti-woke conflict. And I can predict someone's views about the subject based on their views about like abortion or like, BLM or 5 other different things. I think it actually is a very different subject in a way. And the fact that we kind of view things in terms of partisan tribes is more a reflection of us and our culture as opposed to the reality of what's going on there. I don't think it's a woke versus anti-woke conflict. I think it's like a
wait. Palestinian liberation is not an intersectional. It's not an intersectional issue.
No, it's so funny because people just negatively polarize their domestic enemies in a country, and then they see where they fit in on the subject, and then they utilize it for that purpose. So for one thing, Palestinians are very socially conservative culture. That's what most people.
And Israel is the gay capital of the out gay capital of the Middle East.
Israel is, it's a out gay capital. So it's like liberal culture. But then on the other hand, there's this indigeneity or Native Americans and who the Native American situation. There's debate about that. I say with Israel, if you look at its formation, well, I'll say Palestinians first of all. Like all the anti-woke people will say, this is a famous tweet by Ben Shapiro where he said something like, Jews like to build stuff, Arabs like to bomb things and live in sewage, something like that. And he apologized for it later or whatever. But I think that's actually how people think. That's actually what people believe in like a rough sense, that these people are very competent and these people are very incompetent. So we should support the ones who are competent because that's good. And the ones who are incompetent, well,
Okay, Richard Hanania.
Yeah, who's kind of has that position. It's a very Darwinian position. But I think it's actually incorrect factually because Palestinians are very materially competent, actually. Like they're very engineering and, these kinds of... If you look at even Gaza, actually the tunnel system in Gaza is a tremendous feat of engineering prowess and determination and so forth. Their problems are actually political. They have political problems. The political leadership is ineffective, which is very common when you have a clandestine movement. But they're actually materially, rocketry, technology, resisting military offensive for 3 months, and a very proficient military with air superiority. It's not a situation which evinces no skill. They have technical skills in building things and stuff like that, but they have a political problem. So that's kind of a very different issue. They're not materially incapable. I saw people were like, well, you should let the South Koreans govern Gaza. Actually, they can run a material society. It's not like, Bahrain or something like that, where they need a lot of help. They can do it, but they have this political problem. And the Israeli side, well, a lot of the argument for supporting Israel was that, they suffered a lot in the past, and, for this reason, we have to make amends. And if they go a little extra overboard in doing things which maybe we wouldn't say is doing, well, you look at their perspective and how many generations of suffering. It's kind of like a woke argument a little bit. It's kind of like a progressive argument. And the money, all the money is being sent there. Well, that debt is owed morally and so forth. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's an argument which is used by progressives. And even though you can't say bad things about them because they could endanger people, also sounds like an argument which is used.
Yeah, no, it's all it's like a Gordian knot. It's all tangled up, and it's
both sides are both woke and anti-woke.
Yeah, simultaneously. And a lot of it is like you said, it's been culturally polarized, and so it's really hard to stay neutral. And people will come at you if you try to say I don't really know. Just they're not, they accept that. I think one thing one thing that I wonder about though is a lot of Americans have strong opinions on this, but they don't know anything. So it's kind of strange because obviously if you're Israeli and you're Palestinian, you know a lot about it because you're there. That's you. You have strong opinions. But then there's Americans, leftists and now also rightists who are, leftists that are anti-Israel, rightists that are pro, or as they would say, anti-Zionist, and then rightists that would say that they are pro-Israel. But what are they supporting? And then you find out weird things like, there are conflicts between Christian missionaries and Christians and ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredi Jews. And, some people like Charlie Kirk, who is at Turning Points USA, and there's I wouldn't say dissidents, but there are people on the right, especially younger people on the right, that express some heterodox views that are a little bit outside of the normie, conservative Inc. Lauren Chen at Blaze, Candace Owens, also, she's a Daily Wire, where they've been expressing more Israel skeptic views. A lot of it comes from kind of Ron Paul style isolationism, but Charlie Kirk expressed a view from a Christian perspective. So when you look closer, it's not as clear as you would think, and a lot of it is just the superficiality of American engagement with these issues, despite the fact, as you said, I want to highlight this. We give aid to Israel. UNRWA, like the Palestinian. One reason Gaza has a high fertility is because it's got a low mortality rate, and that's partly because of all of the UN aid over the decades, which is distinct from other. Like in Africa, they don't get the same attention.
Palestinians 98% literacy rate in the occupied territory.
Yes, I noticed that, and a lot of that is just. They do get a lot of aid. Despite the fact that they are constrained and whatnot, they do get a lot of aid. And this has been notable for a long time. I remember like observing this like 25 years ago compared to other refugee populations. And then there's also the uniqueness where, you can't. There's this whole thing where they can't go to Egypt because then they'd never be let back. Which honestly probably true, but that's not how we run. There are different rules for this little part of the world. That's what I'm getting at. And that just kind of echoes outward.
It's completely messed up. They should just, this thing with the territory, it's like the world after World War II, like it made a very strong decision that we can't have conquests anymore, like that world of conquest and redrawing borders and so forth. Fine. So borders have a very important, connotation for that reason. So these countries never define the borders. Like, what's the border of Israel? They won't define the borders. What borders exist of a Palestinian state? There's no state, even though the people are there and they clearly live in these areas. They don't have a state. So this exception is it's like a bleeding wound. And if you don't treat a wound, it gets infected and it spreads and things like that. That's kind of what the situation is. They've never cauterized it. They've never treated it, and it's getting worse and worse with impacts around the world. I don't think that the U.S. would be very unpopular at all in the Middle East if this such situation was put to bed and ameliorated instead of treated so polarizingly. And we would be able to focus on East Asia, focus on Europe and areas where we
pivot to Asia. Yeah.
Pivot to Asia. We can't do that now because of this situation. I just don't know. I just think that, it's one thing of litigating it. And I find it so tiresome to litigate it in the sense now because people just have different perspectives. They don't agree. There's a zone of compromise that's shrunk to a level where can't even find it. But why can't we just extricate ourselves? Why can't we just step back from it and not be so involved? And I guarantee you, if people didn't feel like their taxes were paying one way or another for the situation to hold it, which they don't like, then they wouldn't talk about it or think about it as much. They did chalk it up as one of the many bad things around the world, which unfortunately we can't do anything about. But because it's treated like, I think the U.S. should annex Israel, Palestine, and give everyone U.S. citizenship. And then, you can go anywhere you want in that territory because we're all Americans, and then people can be satisfied that way. And absent that happening, then I don't really see how this is going to be ameliorated. Why can't we just leave? Why can't we just leave this area where we have no legal or sovereign rights or sovereign obligation to be involved? That's kind of what I think about it. So when I see these younger conservatives, I understand where they're coming from because it doesn't fit the quote unquote America first thing to be involved in the subject, which is treated to older generations as a moral crusade or like a moral mandate.
Yeah.
Here. That does not resonate with young people because I also think they don't really have a strong view of the U.S. government as a effective tool to embark on moral crusades abroad. I don't think that they believe that that's a good thing they're good at or a thing that they should be doing.
Right. You said America first. I do have to say, I just gotta break in here. The Jewish people. We love them. Great people. Been around forever. Israel, very tough. The best. I don't know. I know that Donald Trump is like a sore subject for a lot of my listeners or like, cult leader for others. But like, he says funny. Whenever he says stuff about stuff he doesn't know about, I'm not going to lie. Like, I'm just like, what's he going to say? Because it's going to be some weird, funny thing.
He's so funny. He's so hilarious. My dad passed away unfortunately last year, but he hated Trump, but he loved watching Trump's speeches. He was just so entertaining. Who cannot? And I will say very seriously, people think Trump is like not intelligent. I think it's not true at all. He's brilliant, but he's just unconventionally intelligent and unconventionally charismatic because he knows that he's funny. He knows that this humor and show business type of way of expressing yourself resonates in the culture of the American people. So and he utilizes that effectively to build rapport with his followers. So, I'm not saying that he's good, but he's just saying that he has talents that, people would be underestimating him to dismiss.
I mean, I can just imagine him saying, yeah, the Jews, they say they own the land. It's in a book called the Bible. I don't know. I wasn't there. but they say God wrote it. I mean, it's like, you don't know. I mean, like, when it comes to like international things in particular, I feel like he has literally never thought about it. And so the extemporaneous humor is just off the hook.
Yeah, absolutely. He's very, very funny. Quite one of the funniest people in public life in the United States ever existed.
All right. At least this is like during the the later half of the podcast. So liberal listeners.
Dude, your listeners not like Trump normally, or are they like agnostic?
My listeners are 50-50.
50-50.
I have like uniform. I've done surveys. I have uniform political distribution. So anything like too partisan will probably trigger people. I mean, I'm on the right, but I don't know. I don't really have like value add comments to offer, so I don't usually trigger them. But sometimes someone will say something, and then I hear it from one side or the other. So and Trump is definitely like polarizing. I think part of it's gendered too. A lot of women do not like his humor.
Right. You're right. He's not very. He's very like, I don't know, bro-ish is understating it.
Yeah, but for an older generation, that would be what you would, kind of like a man humor.
Man.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I feel like, I don't know. Like, I mean, again, like, I don't really have like incredibly strong opinions. I would say that I probably lean pro-Israel, but partly because, and I've said this before in our previous conversation with Sarah and Shadi, where it's just partly because, like, who do I know? And, in terms of like my upbringing, who I grew, my generation, and I pretty much own that, but I don't think that there's like actually that gap descriptively between how we two, for example, view things in terms of just what the lay of the land is, irregardless of like what our viewpoint or our opinions are. There's a lot of facts out there that people can agree on, and I wish that more people would at least start from that basis before they start the discussion, because I think they start to express opinions before they have all the facts. So, I wrote a post. I don't know if you saw it, about like the genetics of the region.
No, I didn't.
Pretty much directly addressing what people have been like asking me for 2 months. And there was just like a lot of false stuff that was out there. Now, have I convinced anybody after that post to switch sides? I don't think so. I don't think it really matters, but there's still a lot of arguments about indigeneity that had to do with genealogy, right? So I was like, all right, if you're gonna force me to, I will bring it up. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you know what? It's like, I was very interesting post, and like the genealogical aspect of it is fascinating. I would say that I don't see myself. I don't want to make it reductive, because obviously my people who I like are the people who are reasonable and they want to compromise and they're intelligent and useful and constructive. Then they could potentially come from any side. And, it sounds ridiculous to say at this point. It sounds naive to say that I'm pro both sides. And I guess I wouldn't say that exactly. But what I'd say is that, I don't want to reduce it to like, I think one side should exterminate the other and one side's all right and one side's all wrong. Just because I don't think it's constructive. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, move the needle. No one's going to snap their fingers and the other side's going to disappear in thin air, even as much as they'd like to after this horrible, series of events. Everyone would like to have to happen at this point. How do we actually just move forward from this? How do we say the past is done and how do we move forward a little bit? That's kind of what I like to focus on. I don't think that there's a lot of appetite for that emotionally in the public anywhere at the moment, but I'm trying to think about it in the long term. And, I'll say before, if you're American, just don't be bloodthirsty. Just think about this in a way which is not bloodthirsty, because you have the comfort and the privilege of some degree of emotional and physical distance. Think about it constructively. How do we move forward from this? That's what I like to see, because I don't think the region or even the U.S. is ever going to be a completely healthy place as long as this is going on. And, I talk to people. I like to cultivate relationships and conversations with all different types of people of different ends of the spectrum everywhere in the world, just so I can learn and know their perspectives. So I talk to people who are super Zionists, who hate Zionism, who I talk to people in Pakistan, in India, every like bridge I like to just know about and converse with, to be like not a Switzerland type situation where you can talk to me, but at least someone like who understands and sees perspectives. So, I don't want to litigate who's right and wrong here. I just want to move on from it. I just want to how do we have a zone of acceptable compromise And I hope that the Biden administration, whatever future administration is in power in the U.S., looks at it that way. And I do recognize the humanity of everyone involved. I recognize the humanity of Palestinians. I recognize the humanity of Israelis. Everyone has complex backgrounds. I don't view one as a zero-sum situation. I try to think of it that way. And I think that's constructive and what we should do, especially as people who see themselves as cosmopolitan and enlightened. And, I will say also, I want to add something that after this whole war started, I was kind of disappointed in the level of polarization that existed because, during the pandemic and some of the events during that, I kind of changed my political views a little bit. I became more like, I was more interested in like this third position of like, the libertarian tech people who I think many of them probably listeners to the podcast. And I was like, these people are constructive and they're cosmopolitan, they're open-minded. And, I was very frustrated with liberals a little bit during that time. So I was like, well, maybe this is like an interesting critique. But now I feel like, well, they're just like kind of the same, actually. They're just the same in a different way. They're as polarized or as potentially not cosmopolitan as the people they criticize. And well, I guess, I don't really know where I fit in. I guess I take a little bit good from everybody. But, that's kind of what I'm thinking about. How do we just find a position? Yeah. And then there are exceptions, by the way, like people who are really like, you, for instance, and Baji Srinivas, I don't like a lot. I think David Sachs has been pretty cool-headed throughout all this. That's kind of like good, but that's not any one group of people who's good. It's just some people who are good from every group. And that's how I view all these issues.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is, I would say, the advice that I could give people you can use is like, and this is, I'm a little older than you, going back to after what happened in 9/11, a lot of Americans, we lost our heads. We got really emotional. And it's fine to be emotional. Like, there were people whose families were, whose relatives were incinerated in the towers, people who had to jump. There's a lot of, like, those videos have never been extensively released, but a lot of people jumped and died, because, it's either they die of asphyxiation or they die of being splattered on the sidewalk, right? Anyway, there's a lot of like nasty stuff that happened that people in New York saw and that affected our emotions, and we ended up invading Afghanistan, which like maybe there's some justification there because the Taliban shielded bin Laden, but wait, Iraq, and like we're involved in all these countries. Okay, so what happened there? Well, we lost control of our emotional reaction or response. And, that's caused massive issues in our country. There's, hundreds of thousands of actually vets who were injured in some way. We don't take that into account. There were hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, for example, that were killed at minimum. That's a floor. I'm giving you a low bound estimate. And that was due to emotionalism. So after that, I've always told people, I'm like, okay, your feelings are real. I'm not telling you not to have those feelings, but we also need to set those aside and think about things rationally and figure out what we need to do given this situation. Now, that doesn't mean that the interests of the Palestinians and the interests of the Israelis are going to align. But I think if people that are interested in this topic are able, as hard as it is, to think rationally, I think some rash behaviors or rash reactions or rash actions might be forestalled. And what we saw last fall were some rash actions on both sides, arguably, in terms of, fueling the fire.
The thing you're saying about emotional reaction, that's normal. That's humans like that. And because human nature, in my view, is pretty consistent or uniform across people, it's the same on the other side too. People, when these big killings happen, these big Iraq war, the previous wars in Gaza and so forth, people react emotionally, they get angry, and sometimes people respond who have proximity to them do things like we saw in this last conflict too. It's like the same factors which drive events on one side also drive on the other side as well too. So I think that, if you want people to, well, I'll say two things. First of all, I think if you're someone who views themselves as somewhat above the fray intellectually, or tries to be a commentator or observer in a way which, you self-deem, and many people do professionally as an analyst or an expert, you have to kind of put your emotions, compartmentalize them. That's very, very important. I don't expect the average person in the street to be able to do that or need to do that, but
yeah,
everyone else who sees themselves as kind of more enlightened should put their emotions aside. And I endeavor to do that. I can be very emotional about a lot of these things, but I just try to, put that as much as I can on the other side. So that's one thing. But secondly, like, that's like your emotions, but also like when you have a situation of people dying, emotions naturally go up in the public and they manifest in ways which are uncomfortable or regrettable or, reckless. And sometimes what you want to do is stop the actual violence that's triggering these emotions. It's like when you have a pot of boiling water, you want the bubbles to stop. You can try to, bat away every bubble. The better thing is to turn off the heat, like turn the heat off or down, and there'll be less, to take care of in that sense. So
Yeah.
I think when you're in a situation which is more placid, people can think clearly a bit more. So it's important when you're in power or you have the ability to advocate for it, to advocate for that reduction of violence generally. And then you'll find discourse and relationships become easier to navigate correspondingly.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think that it's a good place to end in terms of this discussion. And I just wanted to, I want to talk to you, Murtaza, because as you said, I think like both of us, we like to like think about things and talk to people with different perspectives, and that's important, and it gives you a better sense of where you're coming from, where you want to go, what you're in it for, and people say talk is cheap, but if it's so cheap and so easy, why don't more people do it? That's what I gotta say, honestly, because that would have helped. Talking and just like kind of humanizing each other would have helped a lot of these conflicts that we have right now. That's a cliche thing to say, but I think it's also 100% true. And so, hopefully, we're recording this early in 2024. Hopefully that everything, look, I don't think it can get, like, knock on wood, I don't think it can get that much worse. Hopefully we have like a little bit more peace and harmony in the world. Again, like, it's easy to say, but I think we all wish for it. And the important things is your family, your friends, just like living your life one day at a time. And we need to kind of drop the temperature, but also have some perspective in terms of all these culture war and geopolitical things that we supposedly care about. And we go to protests and stuff like, but we're not there as Americans. I'm speaking to Americans audience here. We're not there. Maybe just like take it down a notch, and let people who have real skin in the game, handle it a little bit more. But that's what I would say.
Yeah, and let's endeavor not to treat foreign conflicts purely like reductively as a team sport. Because first of all, it's great tragedy for all involved. There's nothing that unique about it in terms of human nature. People have conflicts inevitably. They manifest in violence when political leaders cannot find compromises. If we have this ability to, as citizens of a country which is involved in this and it can decisively shift the outcome, let's shift it in favor of putting an end to conflict and having a compromise that allows both them and us to move on to more constructive things. People in the Middle East have to be cooperating about water scarcity and climate change and tech and economic development. They don't really have time to waste more generations on this, but they will have to unless a political solution is put in place. And if one is, I guarantee you'll see an improvement in not that long order.
Yeah, inshallah. All right, man. It was great talking to you. I'll see you online as usual. Hope everything's going well with the Intercept and everything like that. And to the next episode of the IBW, I think we're due soon in the next month or so.
Sounds good. Always good to talk to you.
All right, bye.
Whole genome sequencing is used for adults and children every day to assess risk for thousands of diseases. Orchid, a genetics company led by scientists from Stanford, is able to do this for IVF embryos. Now, instead of waiting for a diagnosis, parents can assess if their embryos have genetic variants known to cause severe conditions before their child's even born. No other tests can detect these issues so thoroughly or so early. So check them out at orchidhealth.com.
This podcast for kids. This